management hasn't known as much that open source is being used in their business, especially in enterprise IT shops. And so last year when I did an annual survey, and I have done this the last 3 years, and asked management about whether or not their businesses are using open source, I was really surprised with the results. If you look at the gray bars here, those are CIOs, vice presidents of application development, vice presidents of infrastructure, systems administration, and in previous surveys, those bars had been very, very low, much lower than the developers that said they were using open source at particular levels. And so in 2009, what happened was management woke up and they understood that they were using open source even though they hadn't realized it before, and now they're starting to get it and think about it strategically and to try to put plans in place as to how their companies are going to use open source from an end-to-end level. And so I'll leave you with the second slide, because that's both good news and bad news for those of us who've been in the open source world for a while. The good news is that we don't have to fight the battle of ignorance anymore, because our superiors, the folks that have the big budgets, understand that open source can be part of the solution. But that also creates a potential problem, because now they're very interested in controlling it and setting up who we work with, how it's done, what the policies are. In a sense, we're now into an age where management wants to reestablish control over the innovation that's been going on as this invisible engine underneath. And so because of that, these folks have traditionally been used to working with large companies, safe companies, companies that will give them end-to-end solutions. And so some of the smaller projects, some of the companies that have traditionally moved product in and then built a business afterwards are going to have a little bit of a challenge as management seeks to reassert control. It may be harder for individual new projects that developers discover that are very, very useful to be pulled into the overall strategy. So we're in a time of transition. There's an increased awareness, and that creates both change and opportunity.
Good morning. So, liberté, égalité, fraternité. It's easy to forget what the thing that got you started was. And it's easy to forget in the world of free and open source software that the reason it all got started was because of some principles that were to do with liberty, that were to do with equality, and that were to do with community. And those three things keep on returning to us year after year. Now, I don't know whether we're able to get to my pictures, because those are Dirk's. There we go. So over the last decade, I hope none of you are arachnophobes. Over the last decade, we have seen that the principles of free and open source software have rather been dominated by colorful key individual figures. And I believe that one of the trends we are now beginning to see in open source community, next slide, is that we're seeing a return to the principle of open community. We're seeing a return to open by rule within communities. And that is going to produce change in the way that the software communities actually operate. It's no longer going to be acceptable to have a dominant partner within a community. And over the last few months, we have seen communities like OpenStack form. We have seen, just in the last day, the Document Foundation form. And I predict that over the next few years, we will see a rediscovery of a desire to not be dominated, a desire to be equal. We've also seen that the power of the community is greater than you might have expected. If you have been listening to corporate voices telling you what open source is all about, they will have been telling you it's all about business models. They will have been telling you that it's all about the bottom line. that you don't get everything for free. They will have been confusing liberty with price. And it turns out that the power of the community is stronger than you thought. This protest was in Scandinavia just a couple of years ago, and everything that they demanded up there in Oslo, they have had. Microsoft has implemented ODF. Most of the governments around the world have said no to OXML. And it turns out that the voice of the community is important. So the next thing I would suggest to you is never underestimate the power of an angry community. And then finally, the final trend that I've noticed is all of the fiddling little details are no longer as important as we thought they were. This is a list of open source licenses that have been approved by the Open Source Initiative, of which I'm a director. I'm delighted to say that nobody cares anymore. That open source isn't about licenses anymore. Open source is about the first and second derivatives of liberty. When I say that, what I'm going to suggest to you is the things that are quite important to pretty much all the speakers that have come before are not disconnected from liberty. They're actually the derivatives of liberty. The reason that Google, for example, is able to be so successful is because they luxuriate in the liberty that they get from the free software that they are able to deploy in their business. Their business is not disjoint from liberty. It is the expression of the liberty they have enjoyed. And so getting tied up in all these details about licenses is the wrong place to be looking if you want to predict the future. The way to predict the future is to look at liberty and try to determine its first and second derivatives. So, liberté, égalité, fraternité, I believe are the watchwords of 2010 in free and open source software. Thank you.
Bravo. Dirk?
Thank you. Hello, yes. My name is Dirk Riehle, and I became a professor of open source software only a year ago, after 15 years of industry. And that is interesting because it made me kind of independent person, but on the other hand, I got all these calls from industry, and I was curious what they would be about. And I'm a professor of software engineering, but none or few of the questions were about software development process or the technical details of open source. They were all about open source communities, how to start a successful community project, how to govern it, or how to embed open source in your IT infrastructure, or simply put into products, all the way up to product companies, software vendors who wanted to go from a proprietary product to an open source strategy. So my main trend, thank you, my main trend that I observe is the growing diversity. So I think we are in a phase of let a thousand flowers bloom, and it is about making open source sustainable in many different ways. And so on the slide here, you see my main classification of different types of open source with different motivations. And it's obviously a simplification since there are many different aspects, but it's the core patterns, how the many different levers we have come together. And so I reduce it to, are we talking about a single product, like the Apache web server, or are we talking about literally a distribution like Linux and all the free software and open source software on top of it? That's one dimension. You see the single products versus the distributions or multi-product assemblies as in one matrix dimension. And then the second one is about governance. Are we talking, and ownership? Are we talking about a true community open source project where there's a community of stakeholders all owning parts of legally as well as emotionally, morally owning parts of the software? Or are we talking about a project or a piece of software or distribution where there's a single owner using various mechanisms of intellectual property rights to maintain control of the open source project? And I actually think that all of these are justified in that they have different goals and play out in our ecosystem. So the single product, which is community-owned, is the Apache web server. A community distribution, which is community-owned, would be Debian. Single vendor open source, that's where there's a single dominant owner or vendor behind a piece of software. That's MySQL. And I see here Jaspersoft and Sugar CRM I saw earlier. And of course, then there are commercial distributions where there's trademarks and everything. So that's Red Hat, etc. This diversity that we see here creates sustainability in that there are different community models, different emotional and moral motivation, as well as different commercial motivation. Next slide, please. So the reason why I emphasize this is, again, that I think we're still substantially growing, and in many ways, even though we have found, or open source has found, ways of being sustainable, it's clearly not optimized yet, and we are learning every day about more and better practices and more variations, how things could work out in the long term. And so what you see here is then how I do see it play out over the long term, which is what I call an innovation frontier driven by community and commercial open source, where some of the innovation simply comes out of the communities, but some innovation, and maybe a good topic of discussion, also clearly comes from commercial investment. And on the heels of that innovation frontier is commoditization, because open source shows how you can do software in a community, even those commercial or single vendor owned or dominated open source packages on projects or products will find that in some form or another they can be copied by a community, because that's what software developers are figuring out. And then again, there are multiple business models behind how you even can make community projects sustainable. To that, I will be also speaking on Tony Wasserman's panel on research in open source economic research as well. So that's it from me right now.
So guys, do each other agree with what the other is saying? Do you agree with your presentation?
Well, I'll jump in on one of the things that Simon said. Good. About the first derivatives of liberty. And one of the big derivatives that I see in the developer world, because I tend to work mainly with developers, development professionals, is creativity. When you have freedom to create. And we're seeing some very interesting research right now that indicates that the most creative developers, and therefore the most productive developers, tend to associate much more with open source these days than they do with commercial source. And so for businesses that want to succeed with software and be able to move faster than their competition, if they want to attract these creative developers, open source is one of the tools that they can use to find them. And open source communities are places where they can look for those people to bring them into their organizations.
You agree, Simon?
Yeah, well, I was going to agree with Jeffrey on his comments about how enterprises are dealing with open source. It actually turns out that a great deal of software was based on open source anyway, without anyone admitting it, because you only really become aware that open source is present when copyleft licenses are used. And all of that BSD license software was the foundation of Windows for 2 decades before anyone even realized that open source was going on. So the discovery that open source is important to software isn't a new one, but the significant part of his graph is that businesses have stopped worrying about it and are just getting on with looking for the benefits of the first derivative of freedom here. Profit is the second derivative of freedom. I think innovation is the first derivative. So I see the trend that he sees as well of businesses becoming more comfortable, their legal departments no longer thinking that open source is about a bilateral negotiation, and beginning to realize that it's actually a multilateral community. And that is liberating them to be more relaxed about using open source throughout the enterprise.
I do agree. It seems that it's safe not to use open source in the company, in an enterprise.
Depends on the company. I still know that some very, very big companies are absolutely paranoid about strong copyleft licenses. I'll name no names, but there are some huge corporations that have been mentioned a few times that have got policies of not allowing any GPL software anywhere near any of their products, and always keeping them firewalled and membraned away from what's going on. So there is a good deal of fear still out there. But that actually favors the smaller, more nimble company who, where life is full of risks anyway, and the GPL is just one more of them. And so I think it actually has an interesting debilitating effect on the larger businesses and favors the smaller ones.
I'd also like to pick up on something that you said about the shift away from dynamic individuals. And I think of the term benevolent dictator for life on some of the projects that we've seen. In particular, I think the end result of that is the emergence of community models that are stable and sustainable, and in particular, I'll call out the foundation model. I think is the eventual expression of maturity. I tend to look at it as the shopping mall for open source, where you provide common plumbing, common heating, a roof over the customers' heads, and with those common facilities, anyone can come in and participate in the community. And so, foundations like Eclipse, I think, is just an excellent example of a foundation that has grown significantly. Apache, Mozilla. I think that is one of the most productive and healthy ways that we see the open source community evolving.
The only disadvantage with that is a lot of people assume that the magic is to create a foundation and then everything good happens from there outwards. And I've spent a lot of time talking to people who want to start foundations to solve problems, and suggesting to them they solve the problems first and form the foundation afterwards.
Right. So,
Dirk?
I'd like to add to that you hit on a really important point. You almost naturally gravitate towards a foundation coming from a community project because you want to put into place protections for the developers. You want to have a place for the intellectual property like a trademark or so. So we saw the creation of the Drupal Foundation or WordPress Foundation to ensure that a good ecosystem can grow around a piece of community open source. I would like to add that here as well, I also see plenty of diversity, most notably the trend that I find one of the most interesting trends right now is the creation of user or customer foundations. And they used to be consortia, and in some sense they may still be consortia, but somehow we find that in typically industry verticals, like an example is on my slide was Genevieve, that's the automotive industry, how customers come together and want to enforce open source because they see all the benefits. And this time it's not developer driven but customer driven. So it's customers coming together, creating an open source foundation, etc. on non-competitive parts of in the ecosystem.
Est-ce qu'il y a une question dans la salle? On peut en profiter. Ne soyez pas timide, c'est toujours la première qui est la plus difficile à poser.
En anglais.
Oh, I was asking if there was any question in the room.
Good.
Maybe an English one? No?
They're very shy. There's somebody over there
Yeah?
in the dark.
Okay. Go ahead. Levez-vous, rise and speak loudly.
You mentioned the Open Document Foundation, just really or some days ago. Can you comment on it?
I could do. It isn't actually the Open Document Foundation because that name was already taken by a small foundation that was where they formed the foundation first and worried about the problems afterwards and therefore didn't succeed. The Document Foundation, prior to my current existence as a happy free individual, I worked at Sun Microsystems for 10 years, and throughout that time there were constant calls for Sun to deliver on its original pledge in 2000 that OpenOffice ought to be in a non-profit foundation. There were all sorts of interesting reasons why that didn't happen, but finally the desire in the community bubbled beyond the point of patience, and that Document Foundation formed. I'll be very interested to see what its outcomes are. It takes more than forming a foundation to solve systemic problems in a community. And I hope that we'll see that Oracle will respond positively to that development and help solve the systemic problems as well as embrace the community rather than ignore it. Time will tell. But I think it was an inevitable thing that nearly happened 3 times while it was my responsibility, and nearly happened last year and finally happened this year. I don't think it's any shock whatsoever.
Another question? Another question? Ensuite.
Two things. I'd like to comment on what you said about open source and big software vendors and developers. In some organizations, it's even strictly forbidden for developers to look at free or open source code, because the company is afraid that it could influence what developers are going to write internally. So you said that the paranoia is even worse than that. I mean, the legal department is much more important than the software engineering department. The second thing is about the community itself. One important thing about the community is people are versatile. Open source developers fly from one project to another project. So the commitment of the community to the project still is a problem, because maintenance of an open source project is still a problem. Merci. It's still an issue. I'm myself a member of the Mozilla community, and I'm inside open source software for many and many years. Reliability of the open source software is a problem if a foundation or a project is not backed by a big organization. You mentioned Sun for Star Office, and after that Open Office. We have Mozilla that is backed by the money and the income coming from Google. WebKit is supported by Apple and Google. Apache is, in my opinion, the only major counterexample to this, because
GNOME?
Sorry?
GNOME?
Yeah, GNOME is another one, but GNOME is so distributed and used in so many commercial environments that it's a little bit different. So I'd like to hear you about the versatility, the versatile behavior of the open source developers.
I'll chime in, and then you guys can disagree with me. Okay. So when I talk to those kinds of clients, and I do run into them, and I advise the developers who want to see more open source, the first thing I will tell them is, it's like teaching a child to swim, okay? You don't start by throwing the child into the deep end and, you know, letting them try to figure it out. You start in the shallow end. And for me, the shallow end is, you know, the single source commercial companies that provide strong support, or it's the existing commercial products that already have embedded open source, and you educate them that they are already using open source and there is no way to not. And so they might as well think more broadly about it. So if they're using WebSphere, they're using Apache. If they are using, rational application developer, they're using Eclipse. So that's the starting point. And then, you know, starting to look at specific company-supported distributions. We see a lot of companies, for example, that will use Alfresco because it is something that they can get very strong support from, and it looks like a commercial product. And then once there's a level of comfort, you can start moving them into the deep end where there maybe isn't a company that's standing behind it. There's a community, or there are more complex models. So that's generally how I try to open it up.
It's worth noting that the problems that you're describing about corporate paranoia arise from looking at the wrong things when you're looking at open source. Typically, as soon as somebody tries to work with open source, they tell their legal department to look at the license. And legal departments typically throw an apoplectic fit when they see open source licenses, because normally a license is meant to be a bilateral agreement between two parties who can be influenced. And so most large corporations, when they see open source licenses, their legal department's first instinct is to try to negotiate the license. And negotiating the GPL with Richard Stallman isn't a good thing to try on the whole. Really, they need to think more about black boxing open source and not worrying about the license. The license is typically only triggered by distribution anyway, and the risks involved in working with it are relatively small. And just because it's open source, it doesn't mean you need to look at the source. A lot of the benefits you get are from, for example, what I call community escrow, the fact that the code is in the community and gives you the confidence about the change in the future. Now, you comment on communities. There's actually quite a few communities that actually have liberté, égalité, and fraternité at their core. That you say just Apache. Apache is a huge organization that has fundamentally shaped the 21st century. And I think that to just say, oh, there's only one example is a little bit suspicious. There's also GNOME, there's also Eclipse, and there are a number of smaller organizations that demonstrate that actually open community is going to work. I'd suggest OpenStack is about to be one of those as well, and very important in the area of cloud. And I think that we will begin to see people realize that their freedom matters a great deal, and that freedom is best expressed in open communities.
So I'd like to add to this that obviously companies can benefit a lot from having their developers participate in open source project, but it's not a clear-cut game in that everything's great for the company, simply because highly qualified developers, as they contribute, as they gain status inside the community, say as a Linux maintainer or as an Apache committer, actually develop a broader set of feeling of loyalty, and it sometimes ends up with more loyalty being seen with the open source project than the current employer. So that leads to questions of employee retention and loyalty. And quite understandably so, because a developer who is a committer to an important project builds up economic value that's independent of his or her employer. So it's a two-edged at least sword, and it clearly makes life for developers more interesting and creates more options.
And we're going to be discussing this some more in the communities track that's coming up after the plenary.
Very good. We have time for one last question. Yes, sir.
Yes, we just hear Mrs. Kosciusko-Morizet about. Thank you so much. We just hear Mrs. Kosciusko-Morizet making a slight point between proprietary software and patent software. Who, inside of the liberties that you are claiming, which is the basic foundation of open source, is taking the flag to inform and communicate to the decision maker of large bodies that we have to struggle against the patent software? Who is taking this flag?
There's quite a few people who are taking that flag forward. In Europe, Free Software Foundation Europe and FFII both do a tremendous job, considering they're not backed by a commercial entity, in raising those flags every time that a problem arises. But it's becoming more and more obvious in the free software world that software patents in particular are a big problem. And they're a big problem. I wrote yesterday on my blog about this, that they're a problem not because they are necessarily definitely present in every European country. They're a problem because there is sufficient uncertainty about software patents that a patent holder can blackmail someone into deciding they don't want to be the test case to find out in their country whether software patents exist. And we need certainty in Europe about that. My big fear about trying to gain certainty in Europe is there are big vested interests that will take an attempt to gain certainty as an opportunity to establish software patents legitimacy. And so I'm a little bit worried about heading into that gap. But there are some great voices. You should join the Free Software Foundation Europe. They are an open, balanced, and not an extreme group at all, unlike another organization with a similar name elsewhere. And your membership fee goes towards campaigns like software patents.
Okay, thank you Simon, thank you Jeffrey, thank you Dirk. On peut les applaudir.